Hi, so welcome to our first IHR seminar on Latin American history for this year. I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Miguel Valerio, who's going to talk to us today. Dr. Valerio is Assistant Professor of Spanish at Washington University in St. Louis. He received his PhD from Ohio State University. He's published various different things. He's published in the Afro-Hispanic Review and the journal Confraternitas. And he's currently working on his first book and finishing that book, which is entitled The Black Kings and Queens of Colonial Mexico City, Identity, Performance, and Power, 1539 to 1640. And that is going to be coming out next year with Cambridge University Press. Our comments are going to come from Dr. Caroline Cook. Do you prefer Kaya or?
Kaya is fine.
Kaya Cook, who is currently lecturing History of the Atlantic World at Royal Holloway University here in London. Kaya, in addition to being one of the co-conveners of the seminar, is also currently doing research on the history of racial and ethnic categories in the Spanish Empire. So I think it's a really great person to comment on Dr. Valerio's work. I'm really looking forward to the discussion. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Miguel to kick things off.
I'm going to share my screen here. Thank you, Kaya and Tom, for the invitation and for hosting me, and everyone who is here. I look forward to your feedback and the conversation. As I was telling Tom earlier, I will be presenting from my book, which will be coming out next year with Cambridge University Press. But I was telling Tom that these ideas, Black joy, sovereignty, and being, are ideas that I'm still pretty much fresh and that I'm still developing, maturing. So I look forward to any feedback that you may have on those ideas, especially sovereignty, which you will see here my take on sovereignty, and I have had some pushback and some feedback. So I look forward to our conversation. So I'll just read my paper and then we'll talk. In February 1539, Mexico City descended into jubilation to celebrate the Truce of Nice, accorded the previous year between Emperor Charles V and Francis I of France. The celebration constituted New Spain's first major civic ceremony. It is significant, therefore, that the festivities included a performance, Invención in the original, by more than 50 horseback riders made up of Black men and women with their king and queen. The Black performers were great riches of gold and precious stones and pearl and silver, as well as a great diversity of masks. The Black performance also included a mock battle between the Black actors and a group of indigenous performers. Described by the conquistador Bernal Díaz del Castillo in chapter 201 of his Historia Verdadera de la Conquista de la Nueva España, this is also the earliest American example of a performative genre that became a staple of the African diaspora in the Atlantic, festive Black kings and queens. In Mexico City, there is record of this performance taking place again in 1608, 1610, 1611, 1612, 1640, in both public ceremonies and communal settings. And as I analyzed in my forthcoming book, Sovereign Joy, Afro-Mexican Kings and Queens, 1739 to 1640, it may have been part of an annual celebration among Afro-Mexicans. So from other Latin American contexts, we have evidence, especially in Brazil, Panama, and New Orleans, that this was an annual celebration among Black confraternities. I won't have time to go into it here, but the image on this slide shows the original African, concretely Congolese, martial dance, Cécile Framont and others have identified as an original component of Afro-Atlantic festive kings and queens. According to this established genealogy, the Congolese martial dance was added to originally European royal courts. Afro-Iberians began staging in the Iberian Peninsula in the late 15th century. Though Dia del Castillo text is vague, it suggests all the known elements of Afro-Atlantic festive kings and queens. Festive Black kings and queens would be found all over the African diaspora and have been widely studied in Brazil and to a lesser extent, the Iberian Peninsula, the River Plate region, Buenos Aires, Montevideo, Peru, Panama, Cuba, and even New Orleans, New England, there was a Black governor ceremony in New England, and we have even found evidence in the Danish Caribbean. Yet this tradition has not been studied in Mexico before I turned to it. As the scholarship shows, this performance became a form of festive expression among diasporic Afro-descendants. Through it, Atlantic Blacks sought to recreate parts of their African world as they built a new one, express ancestral and diasporic sovereignty, and some articulate their subjectivities, or how they understood themselves and the world around them. Sovereign Joy studies this performance genre among Afro-Mexicans as an expression of their collective agency and selfhood. In Sovereign Joy, I turn to the only 5 known texts that describe Afro-Mexican festive kings and queens. Besides Dia del Castillo texts, I studied 2 other festival accounts. The first is an anonymous Relación de las Insignes Fiesta about Mexico City's 1610 festivities for the beatification of the founder of the Society of Jesus, Ignatius of Loyola, one of whose 2 examples I will discuss here. The second, Festín hecho por las morenas criollas de la muy noble y muy leal Ciudad de México, which I discuss in chapter 4 of Sovereign Joy, is unique in many ways. For one, it is the only known colonial festival account solely dedicated to a Black performance. It is also the only text that describes Black performance for the festivities that normally accompany the arrival of a new viceroy. Besides these celebratory texts, I studied 2 court or audiencia reports that illustrate how colonial officials could use Afro-Mexicans' festive practices against them. These accusatory texts underscore the anti-Black milieu within which Afro-Mexican practice their festive traditions. They demonstrate that while colonial officials welcomed, even sought, Black kings and queens for public festivals, the same authorities were displeased, even threatened, by the freedom and autonomy that these practices made manifest when staged outside an officially sanctioned festive space. These accusatory texts have received more attention than the celebratory ones. So in the Mexican scholarship about Afro-Mexican kings and queens, the only texts that have been studied are these accusatory texts. For this reason, Afro-Mexican kings and queens have only been studied within the context of colonial Mexico's supposed Black revolts. In other words, scholars have mainly encountered Afro-Mexican kings and queens in these accusatory documents. This has even included the confraternities or lay Catholic brotherhoods that often stage royal courts. By focusing on celebratory texts that explicitly describe the performance of Black festive kings and queens among Mexico City Black confraternities, Sovereign Joy attend to this hitherto unstudied aspect of Afro-Mexican sodalities in early colonial Mexico City. It thus steers the discussion about Black kings and queens in colonial Mexico in a different direction, to a focus on how this performative tradition allowed Afro-Mexicans to express communal sovereignty and their understanding of themselves and of the world around them to themselves and their host community, Mexico City. Sovereign Joy seeks to make several interventions. While historians have done remarkable recuperative work, Latin American literary and cultural studies, my home field, has privileged white Creole letter culture from its inception, although since the 1980s, the field has paid increasing attention to indigenous texts and voices. What it has neglected, as the historian Maria Elena Diaz has lamented, is Black bodies and voices as subjects of cultural analysis. And it is not because those bodies and voices are not to be found in the archive. José Ramón Juve Martín's Esclavos de la Ciudad Letrada, to give an example framed within colonial Latin American literary and cultural studies, shows us that they abound. While the texts I study do not always account for Black voices, they all provide us a different way to account for Black bodies and their corporeal and physical subjectivities other than the quantitative analysis of slavery, for example. At the heart of the matter of Black royal courts are New Spain's subconfratonal groups. Black festive kings and queens were typically performed by confraternity members, as we will see in the example I discuss here. While this aspect of Black confraternity has been extensively studied in Brazil, and to a much lesser extent in colonial Peru and the River Plate region, the scholarship of Afro-Mexican confraternity has not given significant analysis to the festive royal courts staged by Afro-Mexican confraternities. Scholars have linked Afro-Mexican confraternities to Black kings and queens via a 1612 report, one of the accusatory texts I study in my book. This anonymous report contends that the mayordomos, or leaders of Mexico City Black confraternities, who were usually crowned kings, led a plot to kill the Spanish men, rape the women, and enslave the indigenous population in the Monarquía Africana, or African kingdom, they would establish after taking over the land. Here I will discuss one of the few texts in the Atlantic that directly links Black confraternities and Black festive kings and queen performances in a celebratory manner. My analysis sheds new light on the kind of festival performance Black confraternity staged in Mexico City and informs my reading of the two Audiencia reports. In founding and joining confraternities, Afro-Mexicans were taking advantages of the new powers the Council of Trent gave the laity. They thus behave as full members of the Catholic community. Here I propose that confraternity constituted sovereign spaces that allow Afro-Mexicans to set devotional, charitable, and cultural priorities, and the festive kings and queens symbolically express this communal sovereignty. Black confraternal sovereignty took the form of caring for the sick, disabled, and dying, burying and remembering the dead, helping the enslaved escape particularly cruel masters or overseers, supporting Black litigants seeking to keep the family unit together or other relief, and a whole host of other social interventions of this nature in an anti-Black world that made no such provisions. Confraternity thus became Afro-Mexicans' only social safety nets. Therefore, there was a relatively large number there was a relatively large number of Afro cofradías in Mexico City. So this is an example from Brazil. I put slides on my paper and then I forget to do them. So that's an example from Brazil. And this is just the confraternities that were in colonial Mexico City. And there were at least 59 in the whole Viceroyalty of New Spain. And this is from Nicole Volhermeten's book, Black Blood Brothers, which is about Black confraternities in Mexico City. The number of confraternities in Mexico City and Mexico and New Spain, colonial Mexico in general, makes Mexico the second only to Brazil, which had at least 165 brotherhoods in the 18th century. So Brazil had a great deal of confraternities, and Brazil is the only place where Black confraternities are still active. And one mystery that remains is how they, went inactive in Spain, in Mexico, and other places. Festive kings and queens then emerged as a jubilant praxis through which Afro-Mexicans articulated discursive and communal sovereignty, both in public festivals and group practices. I define discursive sovereignty as that which we allow ourselves to tell ourselves and others about ourselves. In other words, articulations about a group's corporate self, fashioned by the group and intended to enhance the group's own and outsiders' understanding of the group. These articulations are often bold statements that defy outsiders' opinions of the group. The group can also surprise itself by articulating a sovereignty it has not been granted. In the performance of festive Black kings and queens, in both public festivals and communal spaces, Afro-Mexicans proclaim themselves and to others as a sovereign community with its own identity, social space, and localized culture. In African Kings and Black Slaves, Herman L. Bennett invites us to rethink the African-European encounter beyond that of superior-inferior power dynamics, but rather as one that entailed negotiation on equal terms. Likewise, I invite us to consider the African diaspora to give account for the many ways people of African descent, and by extension, all subaltern subjects, exercise sovereignty in their daily lives, pressing colonial elites and administrators for autonomy, as Bennett has put it elsewhere. My analysis of this performative genre then interrogates questions of Black sovereignty, expanding the concept of sovereignty beyond its classical conception of white European royal or territorial sovereignty. I demonstrate that despite what has become the norm in the literature about Afro-Mexicans and Afro-descendants in general, armed revolts was not the only avenue to sovereignty available to people of African descent during the age of slavery. I further contend that this performance sought to recreate an African space of sovereignty, one that existed in the horizon of the actor's collective memory. Philosophically, Sovereign Joy seeks to provoke and probe thinking about the sovereignty of subaltern joy, the joy of subaltern sovereignty, and Black joy and Black being. If, according to Fanon, Black being is non-being, of Black sovereignty and Black joy possible? With Imani Pere, Francis Negron Montaner, Diana Taylor, and others, I hope to answer these questions affirmatively, and in so doing, also affirm Black being. Now, I would like to turn to one example of what these performances look like to give you a concrete example of these articulations of Black joy, sovereignty, and being. On the evening of June 18, 1610, a messenger arrived in Mexico City with the news that Ignatius of Loyola, the founder of the Society of Jesus, had been beatified by Pope Paul V on July 17 of the previous year. The messenger took the news to the Jesuit house, where the sons of Ignatius received it with the joy one can imagine. This rapturous reaction was recorded in an anonymous account of the festivities that follow, relación de las insignes fiestas que en la Ciudad de México se hicieron en la dedicación de la iglesia de la Casa Profesa y beatificación de nuestro Santo Padre San Ignacio. Included in the first chronicle of the Jesuit order in Mexico, Andrés de Pérez Rivas, Crónica y Historia Religiosa de la provincia de la Compañía de Jesús de México en Nueva España, which remained unpublished until 1896 and seems to have gone unnoticed since. So this Crónica by Pérez de Rivas, which is just a collection of documents by other authors, for the most part, when it was first published in 1896, and people have looked at his account of Yanga's revolt, but this account of the festivities with Black kings and queens I have not seen anything about that in the literature. As the Jesuits share the news with other religious orders, that same night, bells, music, bonfires, and fireworks stirred the sleeping city, transforming it into a resounding city, as this kind of news often did. Ignatius' beatification brought legitimacy to the young progressive order, founded just 50 years earlier. For one, it put their founder one step closer to sainthood, making him a model of all Catholics. The Jesuit could now use the spiritual prestige of the would-be saint in order to enhance their spiritual and temporal status. In fact, the order had already developed strategic relations with both metropolitan and colonial ruling elites throughout the Iberian world, and now had a presence in every corner of the Iberian world, which at the time included Portugal and Brazil during the Iberian Union. Therefore, Ignatius' beatification, like his canonization would be 12 years later, was celebrated in every corner of the Iberian world, from Portugal to Africa, to India and Brazil, and from Spain to Mexico, Peru, and the Philippines. In Spain, for example, there were public celebrations of the beatification, and this is for which there exists account: Madrid, Murcia, Salamanca, Granada, Segovia, Seville, Valladolid, Girona, Bilbao, and of course, Loyola, his birthplace. And these are only the ones for which documents survive. In the Viceroyalty of Lima, of Peru, Lima and Cusco hosted festivities. In Mexico City, at least the capital and Puebla held celebrations. While there is no record of the festivity stage in other latitudes of the Iberian Empire, it is very likely that no city, village, hamlet, mission, or port in the Iberian world neglected to mark the occasion in some fashion. As in other parts of the Iberian world, the Jesuits had made strategic alliances with the ruling elite in Mexico City after their arrival in 1572. Thus, when the order planned a grand festival to celebrate their founder's beatification, it became a citywide affair. The festivities were scheduled for July 31st, the date of Ignatius' death and his new feast day. The preparation included the Viceroy, Luis de Velasco the Younger, sending 200 men to expedite the completion of La Profesa, the new Jesuit church, which was still under construction. And so this is La Profesa church, which is now St. Philip Neri Church in Mexico City, and it is still there. It has been modified a little, but it's still in Mexico City, and it was consecrated for this in this festival. La Profesa ready, the festivities would include a staggering 10 black performances, one with the Eucharist, float, carro sacramental, used in the transfer of the Blessed Sacrament from the cathedral to the new Jesuit church, which will be consecrated on that day. Another with a float in the shape of an elephant, and 8 dances, sadly not described in the account. The performances with float included a king each. On the evening of July 30, the most lavish displays in Mexico City since the arrival of the Spaniards began in earnest. The festivities began with vespers in the cathedral, after which the 5 floats representing the victories with which God divine grace has and help Ignatius won in the world through the order he founded, were paraded through the city. These floats, which had the form of carros triunfales, triumphal carts, were allegories of Ignatius' youth, science, faith, conversion, state reform, the principal ideals of the Jesuit order. The following day, a procession between the cathedral and La Profesa passed along a route lined with 24 triumphal arches. According to the anonymous account of the festivities, the triumphal arches were offered by indigenous groups and were made up of local flower, plants, and live animals, live rabbits, jackrabbits, pigeons, turtle doves, ducks, and cranes. And it's about 3 or 4 blocks from the cathedral to La Profesa, a route you can still make today. The Relación depicts the incredible opulence of the celebration. A life-size statue of Ignatius placed on an altar in front of the cathedral was so bejeweled that I was never thought that such and so many jewels could ever be brought together. And such an abundance of altars were lit, riot of candles, and a profusion of jewels, gold and silver used, that the city, according to the account, looked like a true picture of heaven. Significantly, amid this remarkable splendor, the author informs us that the Black performance were by far the most inventive, ingeniosas elements of the festivities. And so, for the sake of time, I'll just describe the two, say a little bit about the 2 performances. So this is the first one. As for the Blessed Sacrament, it's the shape of a castle. In front is the Blessed Sacrament, and in the back is a globe that opens up and reveals the Virgin Mary and Ignatius. And then the king comes and touches the Blessed Sacrament, and fireworks start going off. And then immediately following this one, there's another with the elephant, which is a wooden elephant, is a mechanical elephant. And the elephant is also full of fireworks. And at some point, the crowd has to disperse, so the elephant can also go off, blow up in all the fireworks. So fireworks was central also to the Black performance. The elephant performance is one that has a long tradition. It was common in the Renaissance, in the European Renaissance Festival. If there was one with an elephant, sometime there was a real elephant. There are at least 3 examples with real elephants in the processions that were now blown up. But this first cart shaped like a castle is carro sacramental, which is a common idea, but the way the Blacks in Mexico City did it seems unique. In any event, both performances, for me, manifest, of course, that symbolic sovereignty, but also real sovereignty in putting the performance together, the material, hiring artisans to do the work, purchasing the material, bringing the resources together to put the materials together, and the talent also that was invested in in the performance. And so I just looked at a book of many festival cards, and I couldn't find anything that looked like this. In conclusion, why were Afro-Mexican interested in participating in such a clear celebration of empire? This performance underscored the kind of strategic alliances Afro-descendants developed in the early modern Atlantic. So in this performance, and concretely, the confraternity that had the first performance was a Dominican confraternity. And according to the account, the Dominican fathers asked the confraternity to do it for the Jesuit. But the confraternity itself also stood to gain by building these kind of alliances with both Dominicans and Jesuits. Here, the Black confraternity helped the Jesuit honor their founder, and the Dominicans showed the goodwill toward the Jesuits, hoping that both orders would defend, as they must have, the festive traditions which often came under attack from colonial officials. And that's something I discussed in a separate article. Finally, both performances also point to the work the Jesuits did with urban Afro-Mexicans, even if they did not host a Black confraternity. While the Jesuits' work with colonial Afro-descendants has been better studied in the South American context. So in Brazil, the Jesuits were the dominant religious group. And we know, of course, Cartagena, all the work that Jesuits did with Afro-descendants. Early Jesuit missions from Mexico City attest to the work with the city's Black population, a topic that merits further research. Such alliances allow Afro-Mexicans to keep confraternities as sovereign spaces and to participate in public festivals as royal courts, which in other contexts were seen by colonial officials as a subversive custom that jeopardized Spanish rule. Through these displays, then, Afro-Mexicans may have also wished to show these officials and Mexican audiences in general that these practices were not the existential threat they fear. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you so much, Miguel. And Kaya, do you want to take things up now?
Definitely. No, thank you so much, Miguel, for a really fascinating talk. I'll try to keep my comments as brief as possible to allow for the maximum time for questions, given that I'm sure everybody has as many questions as I do. So I'll, again, try to keep things really brief. I wanted to highlight the significance of Dr. Valerio's topic. By focusing on Black joy, sovereignty, and being, his work moves beyond the focus of much of the scholarship that is focused on accusatory texts that reflect the anxieties of colonial officials, to instead delve into the meanings that active participation in confraternities had for Afro-Mexicans. He closely analyzes the sources for insights into the ways that Afro-Mexicans created community and bonds of solidarity through the performative spaces of festivals. Festive spaces could be and were spaces where emotions such as joy could be experienced freely by participants. In this context, Black confraternities acted as sovereign spaces that encouraged expressions of Black joy and Black being. In listening to your presentation, I was intrigued by your discussion of the multiple meanings of sovereignty in the context of the Black confraternities in Mexico City and wanted to know more. So perhaps I'll open the discussion by posing a few questions as well as thoughts. Can you say more about the iconography surrounding the kings and queens during the festivals? Do the confraternity records survive that can tell us more about who they were and what roles they played within the internal governance of both the confraternities and the broader communities they were part of? What did it mean for them to be crowned as kings and queens during the festivals? I'm thinking also about the references to royal and noble status, to dukes, marqueses, counts in the retinues, as well as the mock battles and jousts, which also took place at the royal court and courts of the nobility on the Iberian Peninsula. How does all of this intersect with the indigenous nobility and their roles during religious and civic festivals and processions? In light of this, I'm also intrigued by the idea of the monarquía africana invoked by one of the accusatory texts. I got the impression from your talk that this was primarily an anxiety expressed by Spanish colonial officials, maybe just that one, to justify repressive measures against confraternity members, and not necessarily an interest or aim of the Black confraternity members themselves. But was wondering if this idea of monarquía africana appears in other contexts, in ways that intersect with or diverge from the idea of a República de Negros, and in what ways are República or monarquía being invoked in any of these contexts and by any of the participants? What's meant by the use of the term monarquía here and elsewhere? Do members of the Black confraternities ever engage with such terms to express their civic engagement and the sovereignty of their communal spaces? I have so many more questions, which really speak to how rich and thought-provoking your presentation was today, but we'll stop here to allow for others to ask questions and to carry on the discussion. So thank you so much. So I don't know if you want to comment really briefly and then.
Yes, no, thank you for these wonderful questions and your wonderful comments. You saw I use the iconography first, right? And then in the book, I have a lot of images, 40 images. There's also a visual approach to it. But unfortunately, we don't have any images from Mexico, other than the text, which for me are very ekphrastic because they describe so vividly, right, the performance, especially the two that we look here. And then the longer one also describes so vividly that you can picture it, right? One of the projects I want to do is I want to reconstruct this elephant and this castle. This is one of my dreams. In terms of the images, if that's what you meant by iconography, I use this diasporic framework, right, where in the cases where the Mexican sources are not descriptive enough or don't provide information, what can these images coming from other places tell us, right? So the images from Africa they're all from the 18th century, but it was a Franciscan friar who was in Africa, and then our historians have done the real work of connecting these stuff. And in Brazil, it's easier to connect because there were a lot of embassies from Congo to Brazil during the colonial period. And then the images from Brazil, there's a lot of images from Brazil. Debré, who won in the 19th century, drew images. And the ones I show here, Carlos Goulart, he was hired by the Portuguese Empire to make maps, but in his hobby notebook, he drew customs. So it starts with India, then Peru, ceramics, and in Brazil, he drew whiskey. Of course, we have to contextualize these images. They have a bigger image. But they enrich, I think, the Mexican test, if that answers the iconography question, but let me know. The record is the saddest part of the whole thing because Mexico did not establish a national archive till the 1980s. O'Gorman, the famous O'Gorman Invención de América, was the one who did the push to establish an archive. And the 1850 liberal reforms, right, which outlawed the church, took the church property, destroyed a lot of church property. Well, all the archive was lost, and so the record in Mexico for white confraternities, the records that are in Mexico for Black confraternities are when they got into a legal dispute. So there's a famous case that Nicole Vermette studied. There was a guy who died at the beginning of the 17th century, and he left his house to the confraternity, but his heirs didn't want to give the house to the confraternity. So that became a legal dispute. So we have the record, a pretty good record of that dispute, his testament, but there are other few little tiny pieces, again, dispute when brothers are suing each other. But a friend of mine who does Peru, and when I go to Peru, there's so much Black confraternity records in Peru that I am so jealous because there's so little in Mexico. There were done 2 censuses of all the confraternity in Mexico City were done by the diocese in the 18th century, and that's how we know. And then mentions, right? So there's a 16th century document that mentions 6 Black confraternities, and if you take that 16th century document and look at other mentions, you see, oh, they have been active from very early on. So that's the sadness of the record. So the meaning of crowning is important. So if the theory is that Africans and Afro-Iberians began imitating European carnivalesque court performances, right? And that at some point, the African practice that I talked about merged with the European, and that at some point also that carnivalesque thing also came to symbolize the absence of African sovereignty, right? Or at least that's one of my reading. In Brazil, we do have some record, not very much, of them talking about the crowning, the importance. It was the elders, the mayordomos who were crowned. In some weird cases, they had a white benefactors who was made a count or whatever. So I mean, it was pretty meaningful for them to have this sovereignty. And of course, with indigenous nobility and Spanish nobility in these contexts. Of course, in Mexico, most of the nobility is in the house of the viceroy, right? But the indigenous nobility, there's a lot of people claiming indigenous nobility, claiming privileges, right? And in the Dia del Castillo text is very interesting because in that performance, by all appearances, Black and indigenous actors performed together, and the martial dance was done in Africa. It was done, one group acted as the civilized and another group acted as the barbarian. And in the 4th performance we have in the Americans, the Blacks act as the civilized and the Indians or the Native American as the barbarian, or vice versa. But it is curious because in Brazil, then the way that it developed in Brazil, Black dress as Indians, barbarians for the part of the martial dance. In the case for Mexico, and there has been, of course, a great deal of literature about how African and Black and Native people develop mutual relations of helping each other, of alliances, right, that defied colonial rule. So it would be great to find more about this, but it's a great connection there. And of course, the Monarquía Africana, and I have to go back and look if the original Spanish text uses the phrase. I think it's one analysis of the text that uses the phrase, basing it on Monarquía Indiana. But as I think you were gesturing, it is a gray phrase idea to play with, and also to see, to see it from the other side, because the only way, the only way we find these ideas of Blacks are taking over the land to build their own kingdom is these anxieties that you recognize. So, I mean, this is like, we could sit and talk for weeks. I want to let other people.
Yeah. Okay. Am I muted? No. Okay. Thank you. So yeah, I think now's a good time to open things to the floor. We've got a question in the chat coming from Warren Butcher, so I'll just read that out, and maybe we can take this and maybe take any other questions people have. We take a few and sort of pull them together. So from Warren, I had a question, or more like a request from Ignorance, for more information about confraternities in these contexts.
So I could elaborate on that if you like. Thanks very much, Miguel. Absolutely fascinating. This is from Ignorance. I just wanted a bit more information about how confraternities in this context differ from or the same as confraternities in a continental European context. Are these actually Black confraternities entirely? And do they bring together specific nations, groups of African people? I mean, presumably their social role is partly to bring respectability to Catholic converts, is that right? So you're saying that they kind of assume a different political meaning in the context of these festivities. So just anything more you can say about what exactly confraternities were and what they mean in this context?
No, yeah, that's a great question. So Black confraternities started in the Iberian Peninsula in the late medieval period, and so there has been some research on that. Deborah Blumenthal has research in Valencia. Didier Lahomme has done a lot of research in Brazil. So they're well documented, the research. And actually, in terms of record, there's a lot of record. We have all the constitutions in the Iberian Peninsula. They're preserved. So they start in the Iberian Peninsula, and because among the first Blacks to come to the Americas were Afro-Iberians, right? They brought confraternities, right? But even already in the Iberian Peninsula, they're taking a different nature than the tradition if you think of the Counter-Reformation white confraternity, right? That is all about piety and orthodoxy, right? Showing orthodoxy. Of course, confraternities were intended and needed to show orthodoxy, right? But they also have this festive element and this political element, because they provided legal aid, they provided housing, so they did more because of the precarious lives of Black people. They did more work than you can think of white confraternities. In Brazil and Peru, they were organized by more or less large, if you think of large African origins, right? So you have the Congo, the Mina, the Cabo Verde, and stuff like that in Peru and Brazil. In Mexico, we only have very few reference to the presumed African origin of a member. But okay, of course, as I said before, we don't have a lot of confraternal documents. That testament that I talked about identifies the deceased tester as coming from Sierra Leone. But Nicole Verhemetten, who has done research and confraternities all over Mexico, outside Mexico City, where there were other records in other parts of Mexico, she concluded that Mexican fraternities did not identify in the same way that Peruvian and Afro-Brazilian did by nation. But they did share this political activity, both in being a safety net for Black people, and then being also having these festive ceremony. In Peru and Mexico, even in Brazil, there were some confraternities that were only free Blacks could join, because there was a fee, and of course even slaves could afford the fee if they were out to work and giving a percentage of their wages. And then there were confraternities that were only for enslaved, and then there were confraternities that were both enslaved and free. And I haven't seen this in Mexico, Brazil. Again, we don't have too much record for Mexico. But in Brazil, sometimes they had a white scribe because many were illiterate. And sometimes they had a white benefactor, as I said, who was elected count. So a pious white benefactor who wants to help out. So I hope that answers the question.
Amazing answer. Thank you. Thank you.
Great. We can take a few more questions. I can see 2 hands up. Nora Karala, do you want to go first?
Sure. Hello. First time caller. I'm Nora Rala. Greetings from Houston. Dr. Valerio, thanks for this talk. I'm going along with the sovereignty idea. And I wanted to know, I have 2 questions. One, I wanted to know more about what's specific about the sovereignty or autonomy that's expressed through the performances and the festivals. What makes it different from any other demand for greater autonomy that Black litigants made or other Black organizations might make or Black communities? So I wanted to know a little more about the specific way that these performances project sovereignty in a way that, that litigation or other kinds of demands don't do. And then I also wanted to know more about how you're reading the sources as a literary scholar. Is there a narrative that emerges from the sources? I know them vaguely as a historian, but I wanted to know what kind of reading that you're bringing to them that comes from your specific disciplinary training. So that's just a curiosity that I had, because it is really important and interesting work that you're doing, taking these sources and then reading them in this different set of contexts and interests. So thank you very much for your talk.
Thank you, Nora. Of course, you come with the hard questions. So I'll answer the easier one first, I guess, which is the reading them as, right? So yeah, I'm looking for the narrative, right? I'm looking at this text as doors or windows or peephole that open up to this world that tell us more about Afro-Mexican lives and the role that joy play in their lives, right? Rather than just we're being persecuted, we have, but so I hope that comes through in the book, looking to that opening, right? Reading it that way. Of course, as I had to tell one of the book reviewer, and I because of the want of many sources, it's a speculative work, so that I think one of the things that came out in the review process was that I take risks that some historian might not take, right? Making some claims that are speculative, but that is demanded by what we have, right? To make these kind of speculative claims, right? And I think the important thing is the final message or the final image, right? That joy was central to how Afro-Mexican lived their lives, that they were interested in joy, in affirming their being. And of course, that takes me to sovereignty. So I think that here, concretely, is the difference between a litigation, right, or a petition that they made to the king, is that it's a performance, right? It's a performance that has a symbolic meaning and a real meaning, right? And so after there was the first performance is 1539. 2 years earlier, they're accused of crowning a king to kill everybody and take over the land. Then the other performance, 1610, the example I give, they were accused in 1609 and 1612, right? So these, which was the biggest challenge for me with the book, was reconciling, right? Okay, so 1 minute we're hanging and killing and quartering and displaying black heads because they crowned themselves king. Well, the next minute we want them to come to our festival and display a king, right? So this is why I concluded the talk by saying that they were trying to show audiences that these were not, they were subversive in this symbolic sense, but they were not the existential threat that the Spanish imagined in what a historian has called, this colonial psychosis, right? This constant fear. So just performing as king when you get killed for performing as king, right? Is a very powerful and a different mode, right, of asserting their sovereignty than making a claim in court or petitioning the king for something. So, and also because it's not a concrete claim in court or petition to the king, it's also something that is less tangible, right? And also broader and could have more significance.
Thank you. I really like that idea of it being less tangible, but also bigger. So thanks a lot. That was really cool.
Thank you. No, thank you for the question. All these questions help me think more. I'm going to recall the book back.
Great. We've got another question from Daniel Riddle here. Dan, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, thank you very much for a fascinating paper. I'm just wondering, you've discussed the sort of the fear in the colonial Spanish authorities of the sort of the potential of these performances, especially when they're expressed sort of outside of official boundaries. Were there ever any attempts to crack down on these performances, both in their private use and even were there governors who said, no, we're not going to have the Kings and Queens performance this year, for example?
Right, so there is not, that's a great question, right? There is not concrete evidence of them saying, we're not going to have them in the festivities. There is indication. So as I said, in 1612, just to give you a little bit more context, a Black woman was beaten to death by her owner, by her master. We don't know the woman's name. The confraternity in Mexico City demanded justice, right? Because by Spanish law, a slave owner was not supposed to punish their slave so much as to cause their death, right? Abuse was prohibited by Spanish law. And I mean, my guess is that on the basis of knowledge of this legal consciousness that Herman Bennett has identified among Afro-Mexicans, they demanded that the man suffer some consequences for killing this woman. So the confraternities came out, and of course, the city, whoever was running the virility at the time was the Archbishop on the Audiencia said, you know, Black lives don't matter, right? Basically. And then, according to the report, and the only source we have is the report, and another report is Blacks began to plot to kill all the Spanish and establish this African kingdom, right? But to what extent is this colonial psychosis, right? There is, you know, it's all hearsay, right? What this guy is reporting, but 35 Afro-Mexicans were hanged and quartered and their heads put on spikes. But after that, which Kaya was saying earlier, right? These are expressions of fear to justify repression. After that supposed revolt, which is the most famous in Mexico City in terms of Blacks, Blacks were not allowed to gather in more than 2, I believe. There was a curfew placed. They would bar from it was near Easter, so they were barred from the Easter celebration, which Blacks always had a big part in Easter and Corpus Christi. And we have in the minutes of Mexico City colonial council's minutes from the 16th century, almost every year they mention they pay a Black troupe to perform a dance. It's called dance, and we assume, right, these performances of King and Queens were also called dance. But we don't know what they did in the 16th century, but Black troops got paid 10 pesos, 20 pesos for performing in city-sponsored festivities. But in 1612, they were barred from the festivities. There was a curfew placed. Also, which happens a lot in colonial time, Black women were barred from wearing fine clothing, right? No silk, no pricey thing, which of course tells you that it was going on, right? Because a few years after that, this English guy who wrote the West Indian went to Mexico as a Dominican. Forgetting his name now. He wrote, about how he wrote that the black women in Mexico City were better dressed than the Spanish women. So I hope that, yes, Thomas Gage, yes, thank you.
Great. Okay. We have time for one or two more questions if people have them. I'm wondering. I mean, if I take chair's privilege and ask a question myself, I've got several ones here. I have to ask about the elephant full of fireworks. Just to dig, because it's so striking and it does sound like lots of fun blowing up.
Yes.
What's going on with the iconography there? I didn't realize that that's a common thing that you see in lots of other festivals. I mean, what is there a stable meaning to having the elephant? And I mean, where does that come from? Is that associated with royalty in some way? So I'm just interested in that. And I guess that relates to another question I had, which is, I mean, I think when you were describing the details of the practices, in this fascinating account you have, at one point you did talk about certain sort of elements that seemed unique to Mexico City. And I wondered, could you just, compared with, Brazil and the other contexts that you've studied, so could you just talk a bit about what was sort of unusual and surprising that you found in this particular context compared with the rest of Iberia and the rest of Latin America?
Right. Yeah, so thank you. Great question. So the elephant, there's a lot of iconography about it. And the elephant, again, was another ambiguous symbol. It symbolized both Africa and Asia, depending on what you wanted to symbolize, right? So it was this, ambivalent thing that could be used for this ambivalent performance. When Henry, I think it's Henry the First or Second of France, went to reign, he had 1554, he had a huge entrance. He was in an elephant. Of course, there's a lot of iconography, Renaissance iconography, of Hannibal crossing the Alps on an elephant, right? So it also has that connotation of conquest, if you will, right? That I don't know to what extent Afro-Mexicans were drawing on. We do have a concrete example from 1554 in Spain, in the town of Zamora, of all places. Philip II, when he was still, I think he was still prince. Yeah, he was still prince, and he was going to England to marry Mary Tudor, and he went from Madrid, he went by land to Galicia to take the boat. And he had a friend in Zamora, the Count of Zamora, and he stopped there for a few days hunting. And then on the Sunday of his stay, the Count of Zamora put on this great display that had all these things that. So these elephants were meant to symbolize like the world. And there was a black man coming out in a wooden elephant. So that's a precedent about 60 years earlier. In 1612, the French Royal Ballet put on a ballet that was supposed to be a kind of a parade of the world's ambassador coming to France. And the African ambassador is on an elephant, right? So this whole iconography. The Mexican example is, so fireworks were central to Baroque festival, right? There was always fireworks. So you can say that's the birth of celebrations called for fireworks, right? You got rid of the cannon, right? The cannon salve, and you did something a little safer, but but not so safe. Fireworks. And this Mexican elephant, right? Just because it comes into the procession and this is mostly in the Zócalo in Mexico City, which you must know very well. And there's a king riding the elephant. And then the king gets off the elephant, and then it starts blowing up. So to answer your unique question, both these examples, so in other contexts in Brazil, New Orleans, with Mardi Gras Indians are understood to be part of this tradition, Panama, Colombia, Peru. When Black confraternities perform with their king, they did not make use of European Baroque festival material, right? And what I see in Mexico is an increasing creolization of the practice, right? Or different iteration of combining the practice of king with, in this case, Baroque festival culture. In the other chapter, the women are dressed like the Queen of Shiva, and they multiply her body in a dance, right? So that each of the 9 women represent the Queen of Shiva. Well, these are, and in that they use allegory, which is another central element of Baroque festival culture, right? The emblema, the allegory. So this is what's different in Mexico about, in Brazil. In Brazil, I don't see the use of this Baroque elements of festival culture so concretely, especially the use of floats and allegory.
That's really interesting. Thank you, Marco.
Thank you.
So, do we have any other questions at this point? No. Okay. Well, I think that's a good point then to sort of draw things formally to a close. Please join me in thanking our speaker, Miguel Valerio, for a fascinating talk.
Thank you.
I'd like to unmute and sort of thank him in the traditional way. That would be great.
Yeah, thank you very much for your Peter.
Thank you so much.
Thank you guys very much. Thank you for coming, and thank you, Kaya and Tom, for hosting me. And I look forward to more seminars and hopefully meeting you in London one day.
Definitely.
Yes. Bye-bye.